In the South, everyone knew you, but coming north was a jump into the unknown. How many days could you walk the streets of the big city without encountering anyone who knew you, and how many nights? You could actually make yourself anew. The notion was frightening, for now the world seemed to flow before my eyes. All boundaries down, freedom was not only the recognition of necessity, it was the recognition of possibility.
Ho-dee-oh-ho, ho-dee-oh-ho, ho-dee-oh-ho-ho. Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we're reading Ralph Ellison's novel, Invisible Man.
Yeah, it's a book that I read many, many years ago for the first time and then read it again now. And it was familiar in some ways, but also felt very new.
I can understand that. It's a big book. It has a lot to say about a lot of different things. And it was a very interesting read. It was my first time reading it. It's been on my to-read shelf for, decades. And it's embarrassing that it's taken this long to get around to it. But I'm glad I finally did.
Yeah. I didn't remember it being a fairly long book. For some reason in my mind, it was, tight and compact. And like when I was reading now, I was like, wow, I forgot this was like however many pages long, like 500 pages long or whatever. But it is still tight and compact. Like the narrative is very, compressed in a certain way. So, like I said, it's a long book, but it's got this kind of, forward movement to it.
Yeah, it's propulsive, I think. And it's very clearly written for the most part. There's a few dream sequences and so forth that are a little confusing, but for the most part, it's not like Ulysses or Mrs. Dalloway, right? It's not thorny, thick language that you might have to work your way through. It's very, very readable.
Yeah, the language is very direct, but also, I don't want to say poetic because that sounds like a sort of fancy, kind of not very nice word for it, but the language is surprising and oratorical at times. Also, and this is something we might talk about later, it's fluid and creative in ways that remind me of musical forms, maybe especially jazz, like this improvisational quality to the language at certain moments that is really cool, and I don't think I've encountered anywhere else.
Yeah, well, I believe Ellison was a big fan of Gertrude Stein, and I think some of the repetition that she uses rubbed off on him in a very different context and in a very different way, but with a very similar ear for the structure of a sentence or a paragraph.
Totally agree. I had exactly the same thought. He also mentions somewhere in some of his writing, he mentions Hemingway being a writer that was interesting to him, and I can really see this as a kind of a Hemingway-Stein kind of environment. And what's neat about this is, we're comparing him to modernist writers that we've been looking at pretty recently, like Ulysses, Joyce's Ulysses, and so on. And it's interesting that he's part of a different generation from those writers. I mean, Stein and Hemingway obviously keep on writing like in that later period, but he stands at an odd point, like as part of modernist writing, but also part of something else, I think.
Sure. What do you think that other thing is?
Well, I mean, maybe it's his own thing. Part of it, it's not just a question of the subject matter he's engaged with. That is this question of what it is to be invisible, right? And he's going to play that out in all kinds of ways. But also the sound of language and the different vernaculars, different ways that people speak, but also the way that language can kind of take you into unexpected places. There's like dream and vision sequences in the book from time to time. And in them in particular, the language is sometimes doing something very, very creative, kind of pushing the boundaries of what language lets you do.
Well, why don't we take a moment and learn a little bit more about the author?
So Ralph Ellison had a relatively long life, born in 1913, died in 1994, and has part of his life in the American South, part of it up in the North, especially up in the New York area. And in that sense, the trajectory of the novel and the trajectory of his life are similar. But he's actually born in Oklahoma City, and his father died from an accident, the results of an accident, when he was still very small. And in 1921, when he was about 9 years old, his mother moved him and his younger brother out to Indiana where she had family. And I found a reference where Ellison says his mom thought that, he says, my brother and I would have a better chance of reaching manhood if we grew up in the North. And in that light, it's probably worth noticing that the Tulsa Race Massacre, also in Oklahoma, took place that same year in 1921. So there's a background there that I think is important in understanding his origins. Ellison returned later to Oklahoma and was really involved in music. And in fact, it was music, his talent there, that got him admitted to the Tuskegee Institute, a college where he pursued musical studies, but left without taking his degree. He left after his third year. And then he moved to New York. And his plan was to be an artist. So he's somebody who was musically talented, artistically talented. I think he was doing sculpture. And while in New York, he flowered as a writer. And he also became very politically involved, and in particular with the Communist Party. And his involvement there came in part through his relationship with the author Richard Wright, but both of them separated from the party during World War II. So there's kind of a political history there that's interesting to think through. So as I said, Ellison was doing all these different things, performing, writing song lyrics. He was a photographer. He was deeply involved in hi-fi, like high fidelity, as they used to call it way back when. That is the technical sides of sound production. He wrote book reviews, did a whole lot of different things. And during the years from 1947 to 51, he writes Invisible Man. And that book made an enormous splash. It was a particular moment when people were ready to hear some of the things that book had to say, and tremendous amount of attention came to the book. And Ellison, as a result, had some teaching opportunities. He taught at Bard College. He was at the University of Chicago for a bit, recognized with various awards. And even though he wrote other things, like he wrote a couple books of essays, and there was a novel draft, apparently, which I think was lost in a house fire. He never wrote a novel kind of with the scope or with the shape of what he had done in Invisible Man. So he's one of these interesting writers for whom that book represents a kind of distillation of a whole lot of different elements in his life, I think.
Yes, although he does have another novel that was published posthumously. Somebody went through a massive amount of material and condensed it down and published it as the novel Juneteenth.
Yeah, I wondered about that because I don't know enough about how it was put together. Like, obviously, this is an important piece of writing, but with the translation from what it was in his papers to what it became in its published form, it's hard to have a sense of exactly what that might have been.
Yeah, it was edited by an old friend of his and his literary executor, so it's probably the closest thing we have to something that he would have done. But it's not going to be Invisible Man.
Well, not much would.
For those who haven't read it, let's have a little summary of what happens in this big novel. So, Invisible Man is written in 25 chapters, but also there's a prologue and an epilogue. And in the prologue, we learn that our unnamed narrator is living in a basement in New York City, withdrawn from society, and he'll spend the rest of the book explaining how he got there in a series of picaresque scenes. Most of the chapters have as their centerpiece a big speech, usually someone speaking to the narrator, but occasionally orated by the narrator himself, who it turns out has a knack for this sort of thing. We first meet him as a young black man growing up in the South, about to give a speech to a group of local rich white men in order to win a college scholarship. But before the speech, in one of the book's most famous and striking passages, he's forced to go through a battle royale, this group boxing match, every man on his own against every other man at the same time, where only one person will walk away victorious. It's a tournament designed to hurt and humiliate the young men participating in it for the entertainment of the rich white guys. And even after having lost the match, our narrator is still asked to give his speech on social equality. And for that, he is awarded a briefcase and a scholarship to the local black college. And there are many, many adventures to follow. A faux pas at the college leads to him being expelled, and he heads to New York City to find work. He ends up at a paint factory where he's treated as a pawn by various employees jockeying for status and security, and eventually he's intentionally hurt in an explosion at the factory. He sees an old couple getting evicted and uses his oratory to stir the crowd up into action. This gets him a job working as a community organizer and speechifier for the Brotherhood, a political group whose quote-unquote scientific approach to ideology means that all decisions must be approved by a central committee. Our narrator is perhaps too effective as a community organizer, though, and so the Brotherhood undoes his success. And this all culminates in a massive, violent riot in Harlem. Our narrator manages not to get killed in the riot, but it does drive him literally underground. And this essentially catches us up to where he is in the prologue. And we end with the epilogue suggesting that he's now ready to rejoin society in his way.
It's such an amazing book. And like you said, it's got this sort of prologue and epilogue structure with everything else nested inside it. So we begin and end in the same place in this underground setting. And everything inside is this very like complex backstory. It makes it, I think, a little bit hard to do something we sometimes suggest to listeners, which is to dip in. Like there's certain parts you could dip into, like maybe that opening section, maybe part of the closing section. But the propulsive quality of the narrative in between, do you think it would be friendly to dipping in and out, or maybe not?
Well, the first chapter, the boxing match, was published on its own a few years before the novel was published. And absolutely, if you don't read the entire novel, treat yourself to that chapter. It is incredibly well written. It's incredibly vivid. It's incredibly horrifying. It's so smart and beautiful and awful that absolutely go read that. The rest of the book, I think once you know it, once you've read it, and once you understand what's going on, you can dip in and enjoy whichever parts you like the best, or are the most horrified and want to visit again for the sort of vividness of the prose in those sections. And I think you get a lot out of that. But I don't know if, as a first-timer, they would be as friendly.
Is this a book that reminds you of other books you've read? Like, were you reading it and thinking, oh, this reminds me of this book or that book? I had a couple of those kinds of moments.
Yes. There were two books in particular that it reminded me of, one of which I had just read, and one of which I read a long time ago. The one that I just read is The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Uh-huh. And it was fascinating to read this book a few months after I read that book. They're completely different books in many ways, but there are certain similarities, including a kind of force behind the main character that demands the world to reckon with him on his own terms. I found that really striking. And I was trying to read if there's been a lot of discussion about the comparison between the two books. I couldn't find much, which there are certainly things that are more related to it, but it seems like an obvious connection. I don't know. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The other book that I thought about was Candide by Voltaire, which is the story of a young person who doesn't really understand the world, getting a mentor and then sort of having a bunch of similar little adventures along the way. They're much more lighthearted in a lot of ways than this. And I this book is saying a lot more about the world that, well, this book is a lot more direct about saying things about the world that it lives in. And maybe those things that it's saying feel a bit more relevant than Candide does now, or did when I was 20-ish reading it. But there's something about that picaresque structure of a young man's education that really struck me.
That's a really interesting point, thinking about this in terms of like education. I mean, it starts out that the novel starts out that way very literally with the battle royale. Then he gives the speech, then he gets the briefcase, which he's going to take to college with him. He's at college for a period of time. And then he goes off into the world and he's still carrying that briefcase, right? And we notice it especially in certain moments later in the novel. And it's literally there, but it's also like hanging on to him, like, I don't know, almost like weighing him down in a certain kind of way. And that's all part of his education in some really disturbing way.
Or at least that's how he understands it. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. For me, actually, a couple of the books I was reminded of when I was reading it, well, we were talking a little before about modernist writing. It's the quality of the prose. I was thinking about Stein and people like that. But also, I found myself thinking now and then about Dante's Inferno and thinking about it, not so much in terms of like how the narrator is literally underground, in the prologue and epilogue, but how in the cityscape in particular, once he's in New York, there are all these like kind of vignettes. There are these different settings he finds himself in that are described in vivid terms. And the people who are there are also kind of, animated and vivid and almost exemplary in some of the ways I think of characters in Dante's Inferno. So I don't know if it was the cityscape doing that or what.
And like the Commedia, you've got it structured where each canto, each chapter is centered around a big speech almost always.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And it becomes a way for the author to sort of show off different types of speech, different types of speakers. I think in some ways, maybe because of the time that's passed in the sort of prose versus poetry and so forth, that we can see that a lot more clearly in Ellison's text. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, Invisible Man is a real tour de force of like different kinds of oratory.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I find so amazing about this book is that there's this oral quality to it, like the different qualities of speech, the oratory being central to each of the different chapters and so on. The ways in which there's this, I mentioned earlier, almost kind of improvisational quality to the language here and there that I can't help but associate with like creative musical forms. But it's also so preoccupied with vision. I find it interesting that it's inhabiting both of those spaces, both the auditory and the visual, so completely.
Yeah. He's not invisible in the way that the Invisible Man from H.G. Wells, who scientifically makes himself invisible to the world, he's not invisible like that. He's invisible in the sense that he's living in a society that is unable or unwilling to see him except on their terms, except as what they want to see him as. So he doesn't really exist. There's just this kind of cipher that other people project onto. And he eventually realizes maybe there's a bit of power to this.
Yeah, well, he brings this out in this very powerful episode that he recounts in the prologue. He starts out saying, "I'm an invisible man," right? But then he talks about this experience of one night accidentally bumping into a man who reacted aggressively, called me an insulting name. I sprang at him, demanded he apologize, and there's a kind of confrontation, a physical confrontation, and our narrator is about ready to cut this guy's throat, but he stops. And he says, "I was amused. Something in this man's thick head had sprung out and beaten him within an inch of his life. I began to laugh at this crazy discovery, but I didn't linger. I ran away into the dark, laughing so hard I feared I might rupture myself. The next day I saw his picture in the Daily News, beneath the caption stating that he had been mugged. Poor fool, poor blind fool, I thought, mugged by an invisible man." Right? So, like, the space of encounter, the city, is this place where you're kind of hyper-visible and invisible. Right, which I found really striking.
And of course, he didn't mug the guy.
No.
So this sort of, even in terms of like the actions that the narrator does aren't really his actions. They're the interpreted actions that are put upon him by other people in society.
That's right.
Which he finds very frustrating.
Yeah, like he laughs at it, but it's a very bitter kind of laughter, right?
Well, yes, and he spends a lot of the book just trying to demand people to hear him and not understanding why they don't, or assuming, even early on when he's still at the school and he commits this faux pas, he's trying to explain to the people who run the place and the people who fund the people who run the place that, like, no, what I did was a sincere misunderstanding. Why are you treating this as if it's something intentional? You have to hear me. I'm not bad. I'm not as bad as you're saying I am. And they don't, because there are other things going on in the world.
Yeah. Well, they see him for what they want to see him as, right? They don't see him in terms of what he's actually bringing. And yeah.
Yeah. He's a pawn in this little negotiation between what the administrator of the college and what one of the funders of the college, the little dance that they need to do to make their system keep going.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
He's violated rules that he didn't know he was signing up for, and he's going to be paying the price for that. But that has sort of, he's not a person to them. He's just someone who didn't fit in and needs to be cast aside.
That's right. Yeah, he's like, I keep thinking these metaphors, like he's a spanner in the works or like a cog in the machine. You know what I mean? Like they want him to be a smoothly functioning part of the machine, but he keeps gumming up the works, whether it's at the college or it's at the paint factory or it's at the, in the political organization he gets involved with. He messes up the machine every place he goes.
Yeah. And that's all tied to them not being able to see him for him, and not being able to understand his perspective and what has just happened.
Yeah. This language of vision, which, as you can imagine, I absolutely loved. I mean, I love that kind of thing. It is a really powerful way that Ellison uses to kind of talk about invisibility. In other words, he talks about this invisibility, the narrator, sometimes in terms of darkness, like in that quote unquote mugging scene that we just talked about, but also in terms of light. And again, in the prologue, there's a beautiful passage where he talks about this. He describes himself as being in this hole underground. It's a warm hole. It's a pleasant hole, but it's a hole underground, and it's full of light.
He enumerates how many light bulbs there are in the room.
Yeah, he has 1,369 lights.
It's so good.
And not fluorescent bulbs, but the more expensive to operate kind, the filament type.
Yeah.
Right. And so you imagine what this must look like. Okay. So he says, "I love light. Perhaps you'll think it strange that an invisible man should need light, desire light, love light. But maybe it is exactly because I am invisible. Light confirms my reality, gives birth to my form. A beautiful girl once told me of a recurring nightmare in which she lay in the center of a large dark room and felt her face expand until it filled the whole room, becoming a formless mass while her eyes ran in bilious jelly up the chimney. And so it is with me. Without light, I am not only invisible but formless as well, and to be unaware of one's form is to live a death. I myself did not become alive until I discovered my invisibility." It's a really creepy passage, right? But it's about, I don't know, you know how if you get in front of light, it creates a shadow, right? And it's almost that kind of being he's describing, right? It's only by the privation of the light, the bumping up against the light, that he becomes visible. And so it's such a strange, I don't know, metaphysical way of talking about what he's experiencing, the social experience he's having.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
What do you think about the city here? You know, we're reading this book as part of a kind of constellation of books that are dealing one way or the other with the city. So we read Mrs. Dalloway, we're thinking about London. We read Joyce's Ulysses, we were thinking about Dublin. What do you think about the city here?
So I thought what was interesting about it was, in contrast, for the most part, to Ulysses and Mrs. Dalloway, this is a very isolating city, especially for our narrator. Ulysses and Mrs. Dalloway both had elements of isolation, or people in it who are feeling more isolated. You know, Bloom doesn't have any real friends, and Septimus is completely isolated except for his wife. And, you know, there's a real tragedy to that. But both of the books are also deeply about the kinds of connections between people that you're constantly seeing.
Yeah, it's like a web almost.
Exactly. And that's sort of the nature of the city. Mm-hmm. Invisible Man, on the other hand, I mean, it does have some of that. There are definitely people and weird connections between people that you encounter, but it constantly is repeating the idea that actually all of these systems are quite separate and quite isolating for people who are going into it. Our narrator leaves a world in which he at least thinks he understands how everything is related in the contours and histories behind people, and ends up in a place where he's constantly seeing people who don't know each other. And even when he achieves some level of success as a community organizer, as somebody who is bringing people together, eventually he realizes that actually there was still much broader swaths of that community that he had no idea about, who are still clearly major players in what's going on in the day-to-day lives of everyone. It's just immense and incomprehensible in the sense that you can't gather it all together. You can't be connected to all of it.
I think that's right. I mean, it's like the immenseness, the tremendous capacity of the city that makes him alienated and cut off. But it's also, how can I put it? He's sort of purposefully or deliberately cut off from that possible web of connection. So, for example, when he's living up in Harlem, he's sort of taken in and looked after for a period of time by a woman called Mary. And once he starts working for the political organization he gets connected to, they're like, oh, well, you can't live there anymore. You have to live here in this place where nobody knows you so that you'll be able to like work effectively. And then similarly, when he's in the paint factory, there's an experience he has where he's going off to get his sandwich out of his locker, and he encounters a bunch of workers who are sort of either having a union meeting or planning a union meeting, and they're very suspicious of him. So even in these environments where brotherhood, right, a fraternity is possible, like people call one another brother, he keeps entering into and being cast out of those settings, those quasi-familial settings, like over and over and over again.
Yeah, although the one with Mary is particularly interesting. Mary, serves as, it's Mary, I guess. It's a mother figure, right? Classic mother name. But she is an older woman who is taking care of him and lets him live there, and don't worry about, pay the rent when you can pay the rent. I'll make cabbage soup for you.
She picks him up off the street when he's just, come out of the hospital and he's got nowhere to go for a little bit, right?
Yeah. So she's being very sweet to him, and he is not really reciprocating. When he finally does leave, he tries very hard not to say goodbye to her, to just ghost out of there. And even afterwards, he doesn't really seem to, he thinks about her every so often, but he doesn't do anything to show feeling towards her. He doesn't visit her at any point.
It's very transactional, right? Like once he's got some money from this new employment with the political party, he gets some money to her, but he does it in a way that, like you said, he's ghosting her. He doesn't tell her where he's going. He lets her think that he's coming back.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's very transactional from his point of view, and in many ways the entire time. And he's anxious about that. And that's just not how she understands it. So there's other possibility, this space of, potentially having a friendly, affectionate relationship with somebody in the city. He takes advantage of it because it's better than being on the street, but he also doesn't commit to it in any way. And I find that kind of fascinating. All right. So it's a really well-written book and all. And there's some incredible passages. The main character, though, our unnamed narrator.
Yeah, what do you think about him?
I don't like him at all. I was having a real difficult time with him about in that point of the book, about halfway through the book when he's just being a jerk to Mary. And I was just like, I feel done with you.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
so awful. And some of that is coming from a place where you can sort of understand, like, okay, he's naive. He doesn't really understand what's going on. And he's part of a society that is sort of trying to break him and render him invisible. And that's going to affect him in various ways. But like, that's not how everybody in his position is behaving. So something about him, I don't want to victim blame or anything with him, but I don't know. There's something about him that seems like that before he gets affected by the things that might make him like that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's interesting to think about because he doesn't fit in. Like he either doesn't take for granted the things that you need to take for granted, apparently, for a society to function, and so he makes trouble. You know what I'm saying? Like trouble happens around him, and that I don't think that's an accident. I think we're meant to notice that.
Even in the very early, when he's with his family in the very beginning of the novel, there's that sense of like not quite fitting in, both because he's college bound. He's clearly that kind of kid, but also like, his grandfather dies and gives him some dying wisdom, and he reacts very oddly to it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
He doesn't really understand it. It sits with him and he meditates on it through the rest of the book, but he doesn't have any kind of warmth between his relationship with his dying grandfather or the words that he's given, it seems to me. And that relationship with somebody keeps repeating throughout the novel.
Yeah, and it's weird because it's not that he doesn't have these, I don't know what to call it, upswellings of affect, right? Like they exist, but they don't connect to people. Like you said, he remembers his grandfather at certain moments and tries to make sense of what he could potentially have learned from him. And there's a couple of different moments I can think of where like you could tell there's like an emotional tide almost in him. Like there's this one scene where an old couple are being evicted from their apartment, and it's a moment that's really important for our narrator because he feels terrible about what he's seeing, and he begins to speak up on behalf of what's being done to these people, and he motivates the crowd, and that's sort of his introduction into that world of oratory that's going to become so central for him. But there's also this affective quality, like he's looking at the objects in the snow, and it gives him this upswelling, right? So I'm going to read a couple lines of it. My eyes fell upon a pair of crudely carved and polished bones. Pots and pots of green plants were lined in the dirty snow, certain to die in the cold. Ivy, canna, a tomato plant. And in a basket I saw a straightening comb, switches of false hair, a curling iron, a card with silvery letters against a background of dark red velvet. There's a whole lot more. He says, I stood in a kind of daze looking at an old folded lace fan studded with jet and mother of pearl. And he describes these objects and he says, why were they causing me discomfort so far beyond their intrinsic meaning as objects? And why did I see them now as behind a veil that threatened to lift, stirred by the cold wind in the narrow street? I mean, so like he's seeing these objects and he's connecting it to the actual event that's happening in front of him, which is the eviction of these old people. But it's awakening in him this like upswelling emotion, which I think is part of his own past somehow. This cold wind in the narrow street, right, is like kind of stirring up this upswelling. And there are other moments in the narrative too where that happens. Like, does that make sense to you? Like, do you get that? It's like there's this, like, in other words, I see that quality, that sort of asshole quality that you're describing the narrator is totally there, but it's at war almost with this upswelling of feeling that happens at different moments.
Absolutely. It's really interesting that when he has the emotional response, it's not so much to the couple, although there's a bit there. It's to the objects.
It's the stuff.
It's the stuff.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
The stuff is, it's a long list of the stuff that's outside of the couple's apartment.
Yeah, it's like literally 3 pages long. It's really huge.
And he talks about it lovingly. I mean, he does say he does say specific things about the couple and how he imagines them and how he relates to them, but it is really the stuff that does it. Similarly, you can tell that there's a lot of care for other people later on when he's been a more successful community organizer and he's doing really well. And his position is taken away from him by the Brotherhood for various reasons, mostly because they don't want it to be successful in Harlem anymore. But when he thinks about all of the good work that was happening and all of the lives that have been uplifted, like that's an honest sense of, trying to do good in the world. And that also, though, feels like it is more about systems, if you see what I mean. Like, it's not individual. And I'm not necessarily saying it has to be. I'm just saying that the objects sort of displace the couple, and the system of the organizer displaces the individuals being helped. They're not disconnected completely, like one is standing in for the other, but the individuals are more real because of the objects or because of the network of organization that he's been doing. There's like a level of abstraction that needs to be there for his full emotion to come out. Similarly, he talks really well in front of crowds.
Yeah, no,
he
absolutely.
Doesn't do nearly as well one-on-one with people.
Oh, no. Like, no, absolutely. Yeah, and performing to the crowds, the oratory to the crowds, is impassioned and powerful and emotional and intimate in a weird kind of way. Like, it's him in the crowd, but it feels so intimate. You feel this really powerfully, I think, in this one scene where he's giving a kind of eulogy for a young organizer called Todd Clifton, who died under bad circumstances. And it's like 6 pages long, and it's this eulogy that just sort of keeps looping around and around, where he gives the guy's name and says a couple words about him, and then he says, but, that's all I can tell you, and then he loops around again and starts again. So it's one part of it goes, his name was Clifton, and he was young, and he was a leader, and when he fell, there was a hole in the heel of his sock. And it goes, it's just very simple language, and it goes like in these big loops. And you could tell the audience is like totally with him, right?
Absolutely.
So there's this emotional intimacy, but it's happening in very strange, unexpected places.
Well, and the other thing with that is that, so he's dealt with Clifton. Clifton has come up in the novel several times by then. Clifton's been kicked out. He's encountered Clifton selling something on the street and then sees him being shot by a cop for no reason, basically.
Death by cop, definitely.
Death by cop, exactly. And he sees all this happen. And then later at this funeral, he gives this impassioned and interesting speech. But I don't remember ever feeling like he had that level of affection or relationship before the speech.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I get the sense he liked him okay, but...
Yeah, he was like a guy he worked with. That was sort of the level.
Yeah, and that encountering him on the street was important to him. Like, there's a urgency in that encounter. But it's not like they're super close friends or anything. It's hard to understand what's happened there.
Yeah, yeah.
I wonder, you were talking about the objects as kind of in their abstraction conveying something really powerful for the narrator, and I think that's right. I wonder if it's not just abstraction, though, but also like the history, the layered time that they bring with them. Because I noticed this with that list of objects in the snow, like the plants are fresh and new, but a lot of the other objects represent almost history. Like there's a small Ethiopian flag, a faded tintype of Abraham Lincoln, this old folded lace fan, right? Objects that clearly have been in that household over a long period of time. And that layered quality, you see elsewhere too, in this other moment that I thought was really emotional, bizarrely, where he's eating a baked yam, like a sweet potato. There's just a cool passage. He's out in the street and he encounters some guy who's selling baked yams. And this is a food that he'd eaten back at home. You get the sense he hadn't had this in the city. And it goes like this. He gets the yam and he says, I held it watching him pour a spoonful of melted butter over the yam and the butter seeping in. I took a bite, finding it as sweet and hot as any I'd ever had, and was overcome with such a surge of homesickness that I turned away to keep my control. I walked along munching the yam, just as suddenly overcome by an intense feeling of freedom, simply because I was eating while walking along the street. It was exhilarating. To hell with all that, and as sweet as the yam actually was, it became like nectar with the thought. And the scene's actually much longer than that. It's like such a weird moment because it's like Proust Madeleines, right? You eat a little bit of food and it brings back a powerful memory to you. Homesickness, right? This surge of homesickness. But it's not just that. It's also this overwhelming feeling of freedom. So like, it's like, I don't know, like a key in a lock. Like it's opened up this thing in him, which is layered memory, right? Memory of the past, but also this forward propulsion of freedom.
It also just sounded lovely. I don't even like yams, but that description just really made me want to experience a bit of that. He's a very good writer.
He's such a good writer. So this book has incredibly sensory quality to it. We're talking about the sort of brilliance of the white light that he talks about in the preface. And we're talking about the scene with the yam where you get the sense of the deliciousness. It's like nectar and it's this overwhelming emotion, right? And that sensory quality shows up also in the way in which he talks about sound, like not just music, but sound. And one of the things I found so interesting when I was like getting ready for this, I was looking around to see just other stuff about Ellison. And I was really enchanted to see that, like, not just musical performance, but like hi-fi, right? Which is like a term you never hear anymore. But when I was a kid growing up, like my dad actually subscribed to High Fidelity magazine. He used to build amplifiers, right? So it was like,
Nice.
so I was like, holy cow, Ralph Ellison was in this world, right? And so he published this essay called Living with Music in High Fidelity magazine in 1955, where he talks about not just being a musician, but the technical side of it, like being an audiophile, right? So a lover of music, but also like a lover of the technical dimensions of music, the way in which you could manipulate music and sound and shape it in certain kinds of ways. This is clearly something he's really, really interested in. And while he was writing Invisible Man, among the different kinds of work he was doing, like I mentioned, freelance photography, but he was also building amplifiers and installing hi-fi sound systems for people, right? So this is part of his world. And so it's not surprising that in the novel, these passages show up that are about not just music, but about sound in a weird kind of way. And the one I found really, really, I don't know, particularly striking was this one vision sequence he just has quite near the beginning of the book. And there are a couple of these different visionary or dream sequence moments, and they're really fascinating. But this particular one is one that he enters into through listening to music, particularly through listening to Louis Armstrong. And so it's a great passage. He says, when I have music, I want to feel its vibration, not only with my ear, but with my whole body. I'd like to hear 5 recordings of Louis Armstrong playing and singing, "What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue?" all at the same time. Sometimes now I listen to Louis while I have my favorite dessert of vanilla ice cream and slow gin. I pour the red liquid over the white mound, watching it glisten and the vapor rising as Louis bends that military instrument into a beam of lyrical sound. So cool. Anyway, he goes on, and he talks about this one thing that happened. He got home and he was listening. He says, "It was a strange evening. Invisibility, let me explain, gives one a slightly different sense of time. You're never quite on the beat. Sometimes you're ahead and sometimes behind. Instead of the swift and imperceptible flowing of time, you are aware of its nodes, those points where time stands still or from which it leaps ahead. And you slip into the breaks and look around. That's what you hear vaguely in Louis' music." And then through the music, he describes himself as descending. He says, "That night I found myself hearing not only in time but in space as well. I not only entered the music but descended, like Dante, into its depths." And he describes this like descent and this visionary experience of this old woman and all this stuff that happens. And I thought, God, that's, I don't know. I don't know. Like, I was like really, not so much in recent years, but like when I was younger, I used to listen to music a lot. And because my dad was really into it, there's always really good hi-fi equipment at home. And this idea of like, almost hallucinating when you're listening to music, like being totally taken into it. And so you're like kind of a little stunned afterward. I'd never read a book that talks about that. And anyway, I just found that really wild.
Yeah. I mean, it helps that he has a reefer before he puts on the record. But yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, no, but I mean, but it's clear that's not what it's all about, right? It is another world for him.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, it's very interesting. There's a lot of music popping up here and there throughout the novel, and it plays, as you'd expect, sort of a bunch of different forms, in addition to being a thing that sort of people can break out into various songs when they're at moments of high emotion. And so you're hearing old blues songs or similar folk songs coming up during marches and funerals and so forth. And they sort of arise out of the crowd in a really interesting way. And the narrator has a really interesting, usually very awkward relationship to the music that he's hearing in that way. Like it's calling him back, but he doesn't necessarily want to participate in the singing all the time. He's also asked to sing by white people in inappropriate ways, but it's more complicated than that. Like he is, he's trying to figure out, like, what is the line between people asking me to sing in a racist way and people asking me to sing in an honest way? Like people should be able to ask me to sing, but it's kind of gross in this context. And what does that mean? Like, he teases that out a few times. So there's lots of snippets of song throughout the book playing different roles. And I will say, as is often the case, I read this book with an audiobook as well as having the text in front of me. I find that really helps focus my attention. The audiobook was read by Joe Morton, who's a fantastic actor, and he does a fantastic job. It's a very much sort of performed version of the novel. It's really great. I don't even usually like that kind of audiobook, but this was just really well done.
Oh, awesome.
But he doesn't do the singing. Even when the narrator sings, he doesn't, I think he only broke into song once or twice. And so that was a little bit disappointing, but it's still a remarkable audiobook, and I strongly recommend it. Oh, I meant to say, the other book that it reminded me of course, was The Jungle.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. Yeah.
It similarly is a kind of picaresque story where each chapter is part of someone's education and it gets involved in politics. I mean, it's much more enthusiastic at the end of it than this book is.
Yeah, I know. That's such a good point of comparison, right? Like this whole question of way which, I mean, Ellison is really, really careful not to identify socialism or communism or any of these things as the ideology that's in operation here for our narrator. He's really clear that like all of those are equally tied up in, he doesn't use the phrase structural racism, but like they're equally all tied up in the world that makes him invisible. Right?
Yeah.
But in the same way that The Jungle was like a really interesting book that was also, how can I put it? It was a book that was serving politics in a funny kind of way. Like, in other words, its political vision the novel is the vehicle for the political vision in some ways, I think.
Right.
I don't think Invisible Man is quite like that, but it's got that kind of undertow, that political undertow to it.
No, if anything, Invisible Man is really all about individualism over a collective sense of things. Like the narrator is constantly banging on about his individuality, which, fair enough. But like, I don't know, it becomes, he's so adamant about it. And fair enough, it's being denied to him a lot, but he's so adamant about it that, I don't know, I find it frustrating sometimes.
Yeah, and his individuality comes into being as he comes into contact with these masses of people or these large groups. So like in the oratory scenes that we were talking about earlier, there's a kind of emotional, it's almost like a couple in a weird kind of way, except the couple is him and the crowd. And then at other moments, that sense of himself as an individual appears in these kind of horrifying settings where he's up against this formless outer world. There's a great moment that conveys that when he's in the sort of what you described in the summary as a faux pas, that sort of experience he has back at his college where things go really, really badly and he ends up leaving. There's this kind of complex scene with a lot of people in a tavern, and he's sort of caught up in it. Our narrator is caught up in it. And there's a white man that he's been escorting around. And in that scene, this is what happens. Then a mass of milling men pushed me up against him, and suddenly a mass of whiteness was looming 2 inches from my eyes. It was only his face, but I felt a shudder of nameless horror. He was like a formless white death, suddenly appeared before me, a death which had been there all the time. Right. And it's a much longer passage. And these other moments, whiteness is described as a kind of a world, this overwhelming kind of stifling sensation, right? Different from the brilliant light of his hole underground, but this overwhelming, stifling fleshiness kind of. And in a weird kind of way, it's in these moments, whether they're affective in a positive way, like when he's doing oratory before the crowd, or whether it's in a negative way in these terrifying scenes, that's where he emerges as an individual. And I don't know quite what to make of that, but I haven't seen this happen anywhere else. Though, except, what it did remind me of a little bit, you will not be surprised, is Moby Dick.
Of course.
Yeah. And I will restrain myself from going on at length about that, but that's another family in which one could put this novel. But it really does. It sits so beautifully. I feel like Invisible Man sits so beautifully alongside so many of the books that we've read together. I mean, there's just so much to say about it once you put them together. And also on its own, of course.
And so we come to the end of our cluster on the city. What other books were we thinking about doing?
We had a whole bunch to choose from, right?
We absolutely did.
And also some of the books we'd already done were like super city books, like, for example, Boccaccio's Decameron or
Book of the City of Ladies.
Yeah, all that stuff. But we still had other choices. One of the ones we thought about was Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which came out in 1961, which I still haven't finished. I've dipped into it, in and out of it a number of times. It's a really neat book. Have you read it?
I haven't. I've read some excerpts, but I have not read the whole thing. I've, again, always meant to, but...
Yeah. With nonfiction, and nonfiction, I think, of a really interesting sort in the sense that it's descriptive, but it's also kind of prescriptive. Like it was about a call to action.
Yeah, and it was very effective.
Yeah. No, it reshaped a lot of places like, I guess, New York and Toronto both are cities that were shaped by that book in some ways.
Yeah. Well, we may still get to it someday. We will almost certainly get to Walter Benjamin's Arcades project someday.
I love that book. I know it's kind of weird, but I just love it. So, and you could talk about it in terms of the city. You could talk about it if we ever do a cluster on the shopping mall, which would be a wonderful topic.
Yeah.
Or categories or any of these things. You could go anywhere with it.
Filing. Yeah.
Filing.
Taxonomies. I guess we call it
filing
taxonomies
cabinets
or something. But yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, another book that I've always meant to read and have never, I think I tried once, but I didn't get very far. But I never gave it a serious attempt. So I would love an excuse to force myself to sit down with it for a bit.
It's so cool. What are the other ones you would have suggested we do?
Well, we had a few other ideas, some of which were probably better than others. You know, China Mieville's The City and the City comes up as a modern classic about two cities that are sort of in the same physical space but are in different psychic spaces.
Yeah, I really like that.
It's a really great book. I guess there's Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities is the obvious one just from the name, but of course a lot of his books are about cities.
Have you read Tale of Two Cities? I actually really like to read that at some point. I never have read a bunch of Dickens, and, you know, it's Dickensian, right, for what it's worth, but it's...
I had to read it for like 8th grade, and I hated it, but I don't like Dickens in general, so maybe someday I'll be up for reading another Dickens. I mean, I had a good enough time when we did Great Expectations, but...
Yeah.
And Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities.
Which I read years and years ago, but I don't remember it very well anymore. I don't know. Have you read that one?
I've read bits of it. There are other Calvino books that I've read more deeply into. So, again, thinking about this as an excuse to fill in the gaps of my knowledge. But this is a book, for those who don't know it, it's an imagined conversation between Marco Polo and Kubla Khan, where they talk about different fictitious cities. That's the book. It's 55 cities.
Wild.
And what else? We considered City of God by Augustine for a hot second and then said no.
Well, how can I put it? It's not as propulsive as Invisible Man.
Oh, indeed. And, you know, other things that we've looked at, you know, the Commedia in some ways could fit into this, I suppose. But I'm pretty happy with the 3 books that we looked at.
So what are we doing next time?
Next time, we're going to do a little special one-off episode. Instead of starting a new cluster, we're going to do a little back-to-school episode. It was supposed to be a beach episode, but things happened. Thank you, COVID.
Next year, it'll be a beach episode.
Exactly. For the back-to-school episode, we're going to be looking at one of my all-time favorite books, Louise Fitzhugh's Harriet the Spy.
Ooh, me too. It's absolutely one of my favorites.
This is a book I read as a kid. It was a landmark book. It's one of those books that I didn't realize how important it was to me at the time, but it wasn't until I went back and read it as an adult and I kept encountering ideas and ways of thinking about the world that I'd been using my entire life so far. And like, oh, that's where I got that notion. Oh, that's where that comes from. Wow. And I had no idea that it was all coming from this one book. And the book still stood up. It's still a fantastic book to read at any age.
Fantastic. I can't wait to talk about it together. I
also still have my copy of the book from when I was a kid, which was the first book I read that was separated into books, you know, like major sections. It's in 3 books. And I didn't really understand this as a kid, but I sort of tried to restore it to its original condition by breaking the spine at those points.
Oh, no.
So it's in 3 different sections.
Very Dantesque.
Very literal-minded. It's like if we had one of those omnibus Lord of the Rings editions and you just decided to tear into it and make it into the 3 novels it was originally published as, even though it is one novel, really. Yep.
I think I have my childhood edition too somewhere. I'll see if I can find it.
I have another edition that I use for rereading these days.
And then we're going to do another cluster. And what's that cluster going to be about?
I'm calling it Other Languages. It's going to be novels in which encounters between languages or with languages unfamiliar to someone happen. And we will be returning, first of all, to J.R.R. Tolkien and The Two Towers.
Which is objectively the best of the 3.
I mean, in as much as it's got the Ents and their lovely language in it, which I'm super excited to talk about.
I know. I think that's going to be so fun to talk about the book from that perspective. You know, when we did The Fellowship of the Ring, we did that in the context of a cluster on land. And so it'll be really neat to bring the lens of language to this one.
Exactly. And we're going to be contrasting and comparing that with another book, which has not really been made quite as canonical as Lord of the Rings has. But it's still a fascinating book, and I think more people should know about it. It is a 1984 sci-fi fantasy novel by Suzette Hayden Elgin called Native Tongue.
I haven't read this, but I'm really looking forward to it.
I have. I was doing a bit of sort of self-directed reading into novels about language, and this is a feminist science fiction novel in which, first off, there's a group of people who are communicating with alien races, and then there's also women who have been subjugated, and they create a language of resistance, a Ladan, for themselves. And so it's working on two different levels of how language and difference in language operate, and it's quite interesting.
And then after that, we're going to turn to Eliot's The Wasteland,
Yes,
which I think will be kind of neat to look at. I mean, it's such a, how can I put it? It's kind of monumental, like in a way that's good and bad, you know what I mean? But I think coming at it through language and thinking about what the sort of fragments of language are doing there, and having that be kind of a lens for how we might put that book in its historical moment, and also think about it from the vantage point of where we are. I think that'll be really fruitful. At least I loved that poem when I was young, you know, like in a way that I think only the very young can love, you know, like, you know, where you're like, wow, this is so pseudo. I feel so smart when I read it. And then you're looking at it as an adult, I was like, yeah, maybe not quite. So I'm really curious to look at it now and say, okay, well, what was it doing? You know, what was the appeal of that? What was attractive in that?
absolutely. And yes, it'll be interesting to look at how Eliot is using real world other languages, but deployed in a context where you're supposed to kind of know them as a, you know, literate Westerner, but not all of them. I mean, I don't know how much Sanskrit he expected everyone to know, but I certainly didn't know it when I first read the poem, or now.
Yeah, no, it's a kind of, again, I kind of want to think about music as a way of talking about it. It's almost like kind of a cacophony, or maybe at moments a kind of harmony. And it's going to be neat to think about that oral quality of what's going on, as well as the signification.
So that's what we've got for most of the rest of the year. And I am looking forward to reading or rereading all of them. Actually, rereading all of them. I've read all of them before. This is great.
Good for you. I know. We got a little behind this year, but we're going to do better in this coming year.
COVID is not fun. Getting it twice in a year is no good.
No, I know. It's been a hard year, I know.
But until then, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/58. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.